1,000 years, that is the span of time historians call the Dark Ages, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 to Europe's awakening in the Renaissance. But if you turn back the pages of history, the first thing you sense is not darkness, but emptiness. A chilling void where the great shifts in society, culture, war, and science seem to have vanished entirely from the timeline. We are told this era was steeped in chaos, ignorance, and superstition, that no one created, no meaningful achievements emerged. But have you ever asked yourself, how could that possibly happen? For nearly a millennium, on a continent that once gave birth to brilliant minds like Aristotle, Archimedes, and Cicero. And more importantly, who labeled it the Dark Ages in the first place? No one other than the Church, or more precisely, those who seized control of knowledge, books, and the collective memory of a fallen civilization. When Rome collapsed and the secular world crumbled, the Vatican, in its early form as the Christian Church, rose like the lone beacon still standing. But the light it cast, was it truly meant to illuminate the way, or simply to blind the eyes? Entire libraries, schools, and research centers of the ancient world were burned or cleansed in the name of faith. Thousands of manuscripts in Greek, secular Latin, and Coptic quietly disappeared from the map of knowledge. Only those texts painstakingly copied into doctrinal Latin, a language accessible only to specially trained monks, were allowed to survive. And those surviving texts were kept nowhere else but within the monasteries, churches, and ultimately, the Vatican's secret archives. No secular power remained strong enough to resist. No independent scholarly system existed to verify the truth. For hundreds of years, what Europeans knew of their past was only what the Vatican allowed them to know. So was the Dark Ages truly an era of human backwardness? Or was it a manufactured fog designed to conceal something deeper, something darker? Perhaps history was not lost, merely sealed away. And if that is the case, the question is no longer what happened, but who wants you to never know that it happened at all? Tonight, let's drift together with bedtime history into the flow of stories that have never been fully told, because perhaps within those forgotten fragments, we might just rediscover a piece of the truth about history, about the world, and about ourselves. The year was 476. It is the moment modern history books mark as the death knell of the Western Roman Empire. A child of royal blood, Romulus Augustulus was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer. An empire that had lasted for centuries, vanished after a bloodless coup. This event, according to historians today, signals the start of the Dark Ages. Yet the strange thing is this: no one living at that time called it a collapse. No funeral bells rang out from the Roman Forum. There was no grand funeral for an empire that had once conquered nearly the entire Western world. And, more unsettling still, no one truly recorded in detail what happened next. You would think such a monumental event would leave behind a clear trail in history, documents, chronicles, memoirs, at the very least letters or first-hand accounts. But, curiously, the deeper you dig, from the 5th to the 8th century, the denser the fog becomes. Historical records grow fragmented and hazy, sometimes reduced to mere brief notes from monks written centuries later. It's as if the entire continent had fallen into a deep sleep, or someone wished it to appear that way. And then one name begins to surface again and again. Not an emperor, not a scholar, but the Church. The moment Rome ceased to be a political center, it became the spiritual heart of a new emerging world. The Church, once a small persecuted sect, now wielded a kind of power the Caesars themselves had only dreamed of, the power to govern human souls and their collective memory. Who preserved history during this era? Not the schools, they had been dissolved, not the intellectual class. They had fled, been silenced, or killed. It was the Catholic monastic orders, monks who copied religious texts within their monasteries, translated ancient works, and decided what was worthy of preservation. Stories, victories, defeats, all were filtered through a theological lens. Even many of the earliest popes in the post-Roman period, such as Pope Felix III, Gelasius I, or Hormisdas, appear with roles that remain unclear. Did they truly exist as recorded? Or were they symbolic creations of a time left largely unverified? More striking still, between roughly 500 and 800, Europe's historical record grows so thin, it seems the entire continent was erased from the map of history. Meanwhile, in the Middle East and Asia, records continued to flourish, detailed and reliable. Why was it only Europe that entered a blank void lasting 3 centuries? The question is not simply what happened, but rather what was kept, and who had the authority to decide. Perhaps the fall of Rome was not an end at all, but the beginning of a new order, one where power no longer belonged to warriors on the battlefield, but to those who shaped history from the shadows. If you look at the historical landscape of Europe from the 5th to the 10th century, you won't see the colors of blood, fire, or breakthrough. Instead, you'll find a thin layer of dust covering everything, from the great structures that once stood to the very memory of its people. There are no clearly documented major wars, no scientific discoveries, no grand architectural achievements emerging from this period. It's as if the entire continent had slipped into a deep hibernation. But this was no natural sleep. It was as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over Europe, blocking the light and erasing memory. Even cities that once thrived, Milan, Lyon, Cologne, left behind no new trace for centuries, no philosophical manuscripts, no paintings, no new maps, and strangest of all, no stories. Those who lived through that era, if they did, left no account, or their voices were erased by unseen hands. Meanwhile, if you glanced toward China during the Sui and Tang dynasties, it was a golden age. Block printing was invented, musical instruments evolved, and poetry reached new heights with masters like Li Bai and Du Fu. Further west in the Arab world, science flourished. The astronomer Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations of algebra, the first public hospitals were established, and the Library of Baghdad held hundreds of thousands of ancient manuscripts. And Europe? Europe seemed unaware of gears, astronomy, or even the compass. In a world where the East was ablaze with light, the West appeared to have been drained of its memory. Who stood to gain from this? The answer lies not beyond Europe, but within it. And it had been there all along, quiet, unwavering, and growing ever stronger. The Church. When the people believed they were living through an age of darkness, when they were taught that their ancestors had been lost to superstition and ignorance, they would not question, they would not doubt the one truth preached from the pulpit, the Word of God, spoken through the mouths of priests. They would not seek knowledge, Kitid, because books no longer existed. They would not explore, because any pursuit of knowledge was deemed heresy. The Vatican didn't need to force compliance through violence. They only needed to set one definition: darkness, and let fear do the rest. In a world without war, without debate, without invention, one might assume that nothing happened. But sometimes the most prolonged silence is the clearest sign of a hidden crime, the erasure of an entire chapter of human history. history is not merely what happened, it is what has been told. And when the only voices left to tell the story belong to men in clerical robes, that story will reflect not an objective truth, but a carefully chosen one. After the fall of Rome, nearly the entire secular scholarly network of Europe collapsed. Public libraries were abandoned, secular schools closed their doors, scholars, if they survived, either withdrew into isolation or bowed to the church in order to continue their work. In such a climate, the only places where manuscripts were still copied and preserved were within monasteries, hidden behind stone walls where the light of knowledge was allowed to filter through only narrow slits under strict supervision. But here lies a detail few notice. Ancient Roman and Greek texts were not simply copied word for word. They were rewritten in ecclesiastical Latin, a variant of the language shaped by theology, narrower in meaning, harder to understand, and accessible only to a specially trained clerical elite. While classical Latin had once served the realms of law, literature, and science, Church Latin became the key that locked away the treasure of human knowledge. And the consequences? The mathematical writings of Pythagoras, the political theories of Cicero, the natural philosophy of Aristotle, if deemed incompatible with church doctrine, were reinterpreted or simply left uncopied. Thousands of works labeled heretical, pagan, or unnecessary for the salvation of souls were burned, lost, or consigned to the dark vaults where no one could ever reach them again. Thus began a new era, one in which knowledge was no longer a light to enlighten mankind, but a tool to control it. If someone wished to learn history, they had to go through a priest. If they wanted to read an ancient text, they required permission and were taught to interpret it the right way. Independent verification vanished. Debate was forbidden. History became doctrine, and doctrine could not be challenged. It is often said, history is written by the victors. But in this case, the victors did not need to rewrite the story from scratch. They only needed to preserve what served their purpose and let the rest fade into oblivion. And so, within the shadows of stone monastery walls, a new version of history was crafted, not with blood and fire, but with ink and silence. Throughout history, there are silences so profound they make us wonder, did those periods truly exist? A bold theory known as the phantom time hypothesis sent shockwaves through the historical community in the late 20th century. It claims that roughly 300 years of the first millennium, from around 614 to 911, never actually happened. In other words, we may be living in a timeline that was artificially added. At first, the idea sounds absurd, but when you examine the scattered clues within European historical records, it begins to send a chill down your spine. Why are there so few reliable events recorded during that span? Why do historical texts from different regions contradict one another when dating the same events? Why do certain kings, battles, even entire dynasties appear to be mere copies of earlier history, only with different names? One striking example, Charlemagne, supposedly ruling in the early 9th century, shares uncanny similarities with Constantine the Great of the 4th century. From military campaigns, forms of governance, even down to administrative reforms, everything seems like a reprint of the past, yet no one dared to question it. And who had both the power and the motive to manipulate the very flow of time? Scholars often point to three names: Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, the monk and historian Gerbert of Aurillac, later Pope Sylvester II, and of course, the Vatican. If extra years could be inserted into history, kings could ascend the throne at the divinely appointed moment. An empire could legitimize its rule in the eyes of God simply by adjusting the timeline. and if the Church wished to declare its authority as granted by prophecy, then the timeline itself became the perfect tool. Curiously, the Vatican has never publicly refuted this theory, but neither have they confirmed it. As with many moments in history, the Church's silence is not a denial. It is a way to keep every possibility within their grasp, so that no one can verify or disprove the truth. A force that controls both knowledge and time has no need to argue. It need only outlast all doubt. And so we may be living within a history that has been edited, like a theological manuscript crafted by those who understand how to wield time as a tool of dominion, not through weapons, but through the calendar. Perhaps the world we inhabit is not only fragmented, but staged, a theatre where the past is curated, the future is guided, and the present, a place where real memories and fabricated ones intertwine in silence. If you open the list of popes recorded by the Vatican from the 8th to the 10th century, you'll find a long succession of names, each titled Vicar of Christ on Earth. But here's the strange part. For many of them, there is no concrete evidence they ever truly existed. From Pope Sabinian and Stephen III to names like Valentine, Donus II, and even John XIV, most of the records about them exist solely in documents preserved by the Vatican itself, with no independent confirmation from sources outside the Church. There are no relics, no contemporary accounts, no significant actions recorded, only brief and vague biographical notes. Secular historians have begun to ask, did these popes truly exist, or were they products of a historical reconstruction, filling in the blanks of a period that may have been erased, or perhaps never occurred, the way we've been led to believe? Rewriting the list of popes is not just an exercise in preserving the past, it is a powerful tool for shaping the legitimacy of present authority. If a pope in the 11th century wished to prove that his position was an unbroken line of succession from St. Peter, the first chosen by Christ, then the chain could not appear broken. Each papal reign had to serve as a sacred link in an unbroken chain. And if a few hundred years of history happened to be missing, all they needed to do was insert the necessary names. It didn't stop there. The Vatican also canonized many figures for whom no archaeological evidence or historical proof exists outside of legend. These saints are often described as having lived, suffered martyrdom, and spread the faith, precisely during the very periods now suspected of being empty, a coincidence too convenient to ignore. Relics, bones, and miraculous stories surfaced just in time, as if crafted to complete a narrative written in advance. And in that grand narrative, the Vatican was not merely a witness, it was the director. What did this systematic creation achieve? It built a sanctified history, one that conveyed a sense of timeless endurance and divine authority for the Church, a power that could not be questioned, for it appeared to flow directly from God through an unbroken lineage. And so, no one dared to ask, if one pope never existed, how much more of history has been fabricated simply to preserve the illusion of uninterrupted power? When memory is shaped by belief, and belief is controlled by those who hold history in their hands, then truth, even if it once existed, becomes just one version among many, permitted by those in control. If there is one thing that cannot be forged, it is the movement of the heavens. A total solar eclipse, occurring at a specific location on a specific day, can be predicted and verified with near-perfect accuracy, both in the past and the future. It is a cosmic clock immune to politics or belief, and for that reason, astronomy has long been the most powerful tool for verifying historical timelines. But when modern researchers began comparing ancient eclipse records with the dates found in European history, During the so-called Dark Ages, they uncovered troubling inconsistencies. Eclipses documented in ancient Greek, Jewish, or Chinese texts, when cross-referenced with Western historical accounts, often had no corresponding event. Conversely, certain historical events claimed to have occurred on the day of an eclipse took place under clear skies. The discrepancies were not a matter of days, but sometimes decades, even centuries. So what happens when the truth written in the stars does not match the history written on Earth? In medieval Europe, astronomers, instead of being encouraged to investigate, were pressured to adjust their calculations to align with the Church's official timeline. If a celestial phenomenon didn't fit the accepted historical framework, it was branded erroneous, heretical, or even a trick of the devil. We often forget the Vatican once held sway over some of the most powerful astronomers in the world. The Vatican Observatory, the Spicola Vaticana, was formally established in the 16th century, but long before that, the tracking of celestial movements was quietly conducted and recorded by members of the clergy. These records, never made public, formed a private database of time, space, and the shifting of history itself. Whoever controls astronomy controls the ability to redraw the timeline, and so the truth was bent to fit the religious history imposed by the Church. The sky did not lie, but men rewrote what the sky had to say. Today, modern algorithms allow us to reverse calculate astronomical events with precision down to the minute, and the gaps in European history grow harder to explain. Events once proclaimed as sacred, witnessed by the heavens with an eclipse, leave no actual trace in the sky. And the Vatican? They remain silent. Throughout the Middle Ages, those who dared to look to the stars and speak truths that conflicted with the Church's earthly narrative were silenced. Giordano Bruno was burned alive. Galileo was forced to recant, not because they were wrong, but because they had touched the forbidden, the true clock of the cosmos. Once humanity loses its ability to accurately know where it stands in the flow of time, memory becomes fertile ground for all manner of myth. And the Vatican, by controlling the light from the sky, shaped how the world would forever see the darkness. It is often said that for nearly a millennium after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was plunged into an intellectual darkness. People had no knowledge of how vast the world truly was, no understanding of what lay across the oceans, and certainly no accurate maps. But if that is true, where did the ancient maps, dating back centuries before the Renaissance, come from? The problem arises when certain maps don't match the level of knowledge we are told existed during the so-called Dark Ages. The most famous example, the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, yet it accurately depicts the coastline of South America, the west coast of Africa, and even a portion of Antarctica, as it would appear, free of ice. According to Piri Reis himself, this map was compiled from many ancient source maps, the origins of which remain unexplained to this day. How could a map created before the full age of exploration portray such accuracy? How did European cartographers possess data that, according to official history, their generation was not taught? And the most pressing question, where are those original source maps now? Archaeologists, historians, and independent researchers all point to one place, the Vatican's secret archives. Buried deep underground, behind layers of access restrictions and prohibitions, the Vatican holds one of the largest collections of ancient maps in the world. Yet less than 1% of this collection has ever been made public. The rest remains sealed, unsearchable, unverified, uncopied. And among those fragile sheets of parchment lie geographic traces that no one can explain through conventional logic. There are coastlines depicted long before official discovery of entire continents, islands that no longer exist, journeys mapped out that are absent from history books, yet align perfectly with modern satellite data. This raises a profound question. Was Europe truly as ignorant as we've been taught? Could there have been a class of scholars, clerics, and cartographers who knew far more, but were forbidden to speak of it, or simply replaced by a sanitized version of history? And if the Vatican holds these maps, what exactly are they protecting? The truth, power, or a version of the world that, if revealed, might topple the entire structure of history as we know it? A map, after all, is more than a tool of navigation. It is how humanity defines its place in the world. If you don't know where you are, you can be led anywhere. And for centuries, the Vatican has held that power, the power to redraw the world and then hide it. When the maps vanish, history ceases to be a journey and becomes a maze where you can only follow the paths chosen for you. And perhaps, deep within the stone vaults beneath the Vatican, the way out still exists, but you have never been allowed to see it. We are taught that after the fall of Rome, Europe entered a dark age that lasted nearly a millennium. Knowledge vanished, art fell silent, science was forgotten. People no longer knew how to build as their ancestors had. They lost their understanding of the stars and even forgot how to operate the ancient water systems. A bewildered Europe wandering among the ruins of a fallen civilization. That is the image imprinted on generations of minds. But what if that image was a carefully constructed illusion? Scattered across Europe are pieces of evidence that raise troubling questions. Intricately crafted bronze gears unearthed in the soil of Germany, dated squarely within this so-called backward era. Astronomical instruments of astonishing precision discovered in abandoned monasteries, and underground aqueducts, anti-gravity vaults, geothermal heating systems found in remote countryside villages, places with no known trace of ancient Roman civilization. Who built them? Who understood how they worked during an age we are told was steeped in ignorance and superstition? Mainstream history calls them anomalies, archaeological oddities. And as usual, when something cannot be explained, it is quietly ignored. And in the face of such discoveries, the Vatican chooses silence. Let us not forget. Most archaeological excavations across Europe, especially in regions once owned by the Church, must receive approval from local authorities and the quiet consent of the Vatican. In many cases, significant artifacts are removed to preserve them and are never heard of again. A few independent archaeologists have spoken out about this interference, but they are sidelined, stripped of funding, or barred from excavation sites. In academic circles, they are branded conspiracy theorists, even though their findings often threaten to shake the very foundations of accepted history. The bigger question is this: did Europe truly lose everything? Or rather, was certain knowledge deliberately hidden to keep the narrative of a dark and ignorant age intact? For a Europe that had inherited Rome's light, that had invented and understood, would pose a threat to any institution seeking to monopolize truth. And if you can control the story of backwardness, you also control who appears to bring the light. The Vatican, by maintaining its silence in the face of evidence that contradicts its narrative, does not need to lie. It only needs to uphold the story. And sometimes, silence is the most powerful form of control. Not all truths are buried. Some are preserved all but delayed, slowed down, their natural progress distorted. And it is in this delay that true power is born. When we look back at the progress of human civilization, a strange pattern emerges. From ancient Rome to the Renaissance, the pace of invention was almost frozen. A simple mechanism like the rotating shaft, something the Greeks had mastered, did not reappear until the 13th century. Principles of mechanics, astronomy, and medicine, once explored by Aristotle, Galen, and Archimedes, vanished, only to resurface centuries later, as if they were entirely new discoveries. The real question is not why this knowledge disappeared, but who delayed its transmission and for what purpose. Once again, the answer points us back to the Vatican, the sole institution that preserved ancient manuscripts, controlled the vast network of monasteries, schools, and Europe's largest libraries for centuries. In their hands lay the world's knowledge. And the point is not that they destroyed it, but that they selectively stored it, releasing it slowly in carefully measured doses. When a religious power controls not only souls but also the flow of history, delay becomes a weapon. A society that only copies the Bible and asks no questions will not invent. A generation taught only of heaven and hell will not concern itself with astronomy or anatomy. 1,000 years without innovation does not mean people were ignorant. It may mean they were steered into a pre-written historical script. In this way, time itself ceased to be an objective flow. It became a tool of control. If you control the timeline, you control both the past and the future. The Vatican did this by controlling official history, dictating the dates of events, deciding when something was allowed to exist in humanity's collective memory. They slowed awakening, not with swords, but by delaying knowledge. And when the world finally rediscovered what once existed, the Church was there to lead the way, as if they had not hidden it all along. It was a subtle strategy, requiring no war, no bloodshed, only the gentle bending of time at just the right moment. And in that controlled flow, an entire civilization would move more slowly, awaiting permission from the hand that held the clock. At the heart of the Vatican, beneath ancient stone blocks where sunlight has never reached, lies a vault shrouded in more legend than fact. It is the Vatican's secret archive, Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, a place whose very name is enough to send shivers down the spine of scholars for what might lie behind its locked doors. This archive is no myth, it is entirely real, but no one in modern history has been granted full access to it. There are no public tours, no detailed interior photographs, and anyone wishing to study its contents, whether a university professor or an international researcher, must endure layers of approval, strict time limits, restrictions on what materials they may access, and no copies may ever leave. It is said that inside lie over 50 kilometers of shelving, holding more than 1 million documents, spanning from the 8th century to the present day. What the public knows is just the tip of the iceberg. The submerged part, the truly sensitive part, remains unseen. No pope has openly entered every section, no cleric has revealed its deepest contents, and every detailed map of the archive's layout remains strictly classified. Rumor has it the archive holds original manuscripts excluded from the Bible, secret records of heresies and ancient magic, private journals of popes from the earliest days to the present, including things they would never publicly confess, and most intriguingly, ancient maps depicting the world in ways vastly different from what we are taught. Yet what makes the Vatican's secret archive so unique is not the volume of documents, but the way they are withheld. Centuries ago, the Vatican defined the word secretum not as secret in the modern sense, but as private. It was a clever linguistic shield. We are not hiding, we are simply keeping it private. But if what you are keeping private includes the truth about human history, is it still just an archive? No one knows exactly what is concealed within. But everyone knows this: if there is any place on earth capable of guarding the missing pieces of history, it is this one. Not because of its depth, but because of the absolute silence that surrounds it. And when a religious institution holds a library where even kings, professors, and scholars cannot freely enter, then perhaps true power does not rest upon a throne, but upon a shelf no one has yet been allowed to fully read. There are documents that were not lost, not damaged, not destroyed by war, but simply hidden, carefully, systematically, intentionally. Inside the Vatican secret archive, according to scattered accounts from a few scholars granted limited access. There are ancient manuscripts that predate the Middle Ages, even the very birth of the Christian Church. They are not myths. They do not come from distant eastern lands. They are the products of a body of knowledge that once existed within Europe itself, before that light of knowledge was dimmed beneath the cloak of faith. Some of these manuscripts are said to be written in ancient languages not yet fully deciphered, perhaps a Proto-Latin or even heretical Greek. They contain astonishingly accurate astronomical records, anatomical diagrams of the human body, and philosophical reflections that far surpass the theocratic worldview the Church would later impose. Why are they hidden? Because they conflict with the constructed order. If there were proof that Europeans once possessed advanced knowledge even during the so-called Dark Ages, the entire narrative of Christ brought light back to a dark world would crumble. If wisdom existed outside of the Bible, the Church would lose its claim to sole authority over truth. An ancient manuscript detailing non-Euclidean geometry from the 4th century. Another describing planetary motion along elliptical orbits, concepts not publicly introduced until Kepler's time. Or a medical handbook from Gaul, written in a mix of Latin and Celtic, containing healing formulas modern medicine still cannot replicate. These things were not forgotten and they were concealed. And the strange thing is this: whenever someone happens to uncover a fragment, a passage, a single page, someone always appears to retrieve it, invariably under the guise of cultural preservation or protecting the faithful from distortion. But truth does not need preservation in the shadows. It needs only to be free. Yet the Vatican, acting as both guardian and gatekeeper, has granted itself the power to decide what may be revealed, what must remain dangerous. And dangerous here does not mean false, but rather too true, too soon. Perhaps these manuscripts have not been lost at all. They may still lie preserved within stone walls upon wooden shelves in perfect conditions, but as long as they remain unread, unshared, unseen, they might as well not exist. And that is the most insidious form of destruction history has ever known. Knowledge preserved so that it can never spread. Perhaps no book in human history has been more tightly controlled across the millennia than the Bible. More than just a sacred text, it has served as the legal, political, and social foundation for a vast spiritual empire stretching from Europe to South America. Yet what few people realize is this: the Bible we read today is not the original, but the result of a long process of editing, selecting, excluding, and erasing. The Vatican has never denied this, but it has never explained why certain texts were excluded or what might happen if they were released to the public. Scholars refer to them as apocrypha, but the word apocryphal here does not mean false. It simply means these writings were not permitted to circulate, not to be read in church, and not included in the official canon of the Bible. Among them are powerful texts: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Book of Enoch, and the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. These writings present a very different image of Jesus. not as a distant supernatural figure, but as a spiritual teacher calling for inner awakening and urging people to seek the truth within themselves, rather than depending on any religious institution. If that were accepted, what then of the Church's unique role? What of its position as the intermediary between man and God? Some texts go even further. Speaking of human history before Adam, describing cycles of destruction and rebirth on earth, or referencing the existence of beings of light not part of the visible world. Such ideas stand in direct opposition to the creation doctrine the Vatican has upheld for thousands of years, and so rather than allowing these texts into academic discourse, they were stamped as heretical, not to be printed, not to be taught, not to be discussed. For centuries, simply possessing a copy of one of these texts could lead to execution, burning at the stake, or life imprisonment. Even more telling, many of these texts were later discovered in ancient monasteries, secretly copied by monks, as if they knew that one day the truth would need to be told. Today, although some of these works have been declassified and republished, the Vatican still refuses to recognize the doctrinal value of any of them. They remain silent. They invoke sacred tradition. Yet with each passing day, the question becomes more obvious. If these writings were truly worthless, why hide them so well? Perhaps what the Vatican fears most is not that people will believe the words, but that people will start asking questions. And in history, every true awakening has always begun with a question that seemed, at first, harmless. Not every war is fought on the battlefield. Some wars are far more silent, with no swords or shields, yet capable of setting entire civilizations back by centuries. These are the wars waged against ideas, where the enemy is knowledge itself. Throughout the Middle Ages, and especially during the so-called Dark Ages, anyone who dared to question official doctrine, explore forbidden subjects, or even be too curious, risked being branded a heretic. And for that crime, the punishment was never light. One of the most striking examples is Giordano Bruno, philosopher, cosmologist, Dominican friar. He was no rebel. He believed so deeply in the greatness of creation that he could not accept that the universe had only one center. He taught that there were countless worlds, countless suns, that God could not be confined to what was written in Scripture. For these ideas, the Vatican burned him alive in 1600, in Rome's Campo dei Fiori, amidst prayers and the cold silence of the ecclesiastical court. Bruno was just one of thousands. Monks who dared translate ancient manuscripts, researchers in ancient medicine, astronomers, historians, anyone who touched knowledge that had not been approved, all risked charges of heresy. They were tried in secret courts where no evidence was needed, only accusation. Sentences ranged from lifelong imprisonment to torture for repentance or burning at the stake to purify the soul. People often speak of the Inquisition as an era of religious terror, but few understand that it was the most sophisticated machine ever built to eliminate intellectual dissent. It punished not only individuals but ideas. Books were burned, manuscripts erased, truth itself was extinguished before it could spread. Many works were sentenced to die with their authors. A book that took 20 years to write could be reduced to ashes in minutes. More terrifying still, the long silence that followed made future generations believe those works had never existed at all. In such an atmosphere, silence meant survival, questioning meant death. And over time, silence itself became a form of complicity, allowing an entire continent to drift into a slumber of knowledge that lasted for centuries. The Vatican, wielding power as both religious authority and political force, and as the keeper of knowledge, had no need to prove it was right. It only needed to maintain control, purge those who were too awake, and that was enough to keep truth buried in darkness. When we think of medieval monastic orders, we often imagine peaceful monks living in remote monasteries, reading scripture and copying the Bible. But beneath that serene image lay a highly organized network, quiet yet far-reaching, operating much like an intelligence service whose true mission was books. From the 8th century onward, as empires collapsed, libraries disintegrated, and ancient knowledge scattered across the land, the Church embarked on a subtle yet relentless campaign to collect every surviving manuscript before it could fall into heretical hands. Who carried out this mission? Not popes, not kings. The task fell to the monastic orders, and particularly the Benedictines, whose monks were present in nearly every major monastery across Italy, France, England, and Germany. The Franciscans, whose initial mission was humility and learning, but who also proved adept at reaching local communities. The Dominicans, the future enforcers of the Inquisition, and perhaps the most formidable of all, the Jesuits, men of intellect, strategy, and absolute loyalty to the Vatican. Under the banner of spreading the faith and preserving religious heritage, monks were granted access to every land, every library, and every scholar known to possess valuable manuscripts. They did not arrive with swords, but with invitations, prayers, and empty satchels ready to be filled. Countless ancient texts, Greek, Roman, Persian, Egyptian, from mathematics and philosophy to astronomy, were borrowed for safekeeping and never returned. Entire libraries that once held thousands of books, after a century under the care of monks, were reduced to shelves containing only the Bible and its commentaries. Anything that did not serve doctrine was removed or rewritten to fit theological narratives. And the originals, of course, they were not burned. Burning was barbaric. The Vatican was far more refined. The texts were placed somewhere safe, where no one could see them, access them, or even know how many existed. The Vatican's secret archive, as we have already seen, became the final resting place for most of these manuscripts. And it was through these quiet, persistent, subterranean monastic channels that the Vatican amassed not only the faith of the Western world, but the deepest memory of human civilization itself. For centuries, these monks were more than clerics. They were archivists, censors, and erasers of history, professionals at it. There was no need to destroy. Possession alone was enough. There was no need to argue. Silence sufficed, and as the ancient light of knowledge was hidden behind stone walls, people began to believe the world around them was truly dark, because the light had been gathered into a single lamp, held by those who would allow it to shine only when they deemed it fit. When the light of knowledge is gathered into a single place, and all others are forced to live in darkness, the inevitable happens. Some will find a way to keep the light for themselves. Not everyone bowed their heads. Not every scholar was burned at the stake. Some survived, not by betraying the truth, but by hiding with it. And slowly, over time, across generations, a secret network began to form, the secret societies. There is no official record pinpointing when these societies first emerged, but from the 11th to the 14th centuries, their traces began to appear. Strange symbols etched into churches, mysterious carvings in crypts, architectural works of remarkable sophistication that contained knowledge well beyond their era. Among them, the most prominent, Freemasons. Originally master builders, they evolved into a closed intellectual community, rich with codes, rituals, and an intricate hierarchy. They constructed Europe's greatest cathedrals, yet adorned them with symbols unrelated to Christianity: the sun, the moon, the eye, spirals, mathematical ratios. Rosicrucians, a mystical brotherhood rumored to possess ancient wisdom from Egypt and Babylon, passed down through generations in handwritten manuscripts and layered metaphors. Alchemists, branded by the church as sorcerers, but in truth chemists, philosophers, and astronomers seeking truths beyond the boundaries of sanctioned faith. These societies shared a common thread. They did not deny religion, but neither did they submit to it. They believed there existed a primordial stream of knowledge, deeper, older, and truer, which predated the religious institutions that later sought to redefine reality. And most crucially, they suspected that the Vatican had seized much of that knowledge and buried it behind stone walls. This is why many Masonic symbols can be read as underground maps, a way to pass on truth through imagery during times when spoken words could lead one to the stake. Geometric designs, symbols like the letter G, God, geometry, gnosis, or the compass and square, all encoded ancient wisdom understood only by those who were initiated. The secret societies did not openly confront the Vatican, but in the shadows they served as a counterbalance. They did not seek to overthrow religious authority, only to ensure that the flame of knowledge was not extinguished. And this raises a deeper question. If secret societies managed to preserve fragments of the truth for centuries, it means that the Vatican could not control everything. History, no matter how distorted, always leaves traces. And sometimes it is those who operate quietly on the fringes who hold the final key, the one that can unlock the door leading out of the dark ages. When the light of knowledge is gathered into a single place, and all others are forced to live in darkness, the inevitable happens. Some will find a way to keep the light for themselves. Not everyone bowed their heads. Not every scholar was burned at the stake. Some survived, not by betraying the truth, but by hiding with it. And slowly, over time, across generations, a secret network began to form, the secret societies. There is no official record pinpointing when these societies first emerged, but from the 11th to the 14th centuries, their traces began to appear. Strange symbols etched into churches, mysterious carvings in crypts, architectural works of remarkable sophistication that contained knowledge well beyond their era. Among them, the most prominent, Freemasons. Originally master builders, they evolved into a closed intellectual community, rich with codes, rituals, and an intricate hierarchy. They constructed Europe's greatest cathedrals, yet adorned them with symbols unrelated to Christianity: the sun, the moon, the eye, spirals, mathematical ratios. Rosicrucians, a mystical brotherhood rumored to possess ancient wisdom from Egypt and Babylon, passed down through generations in handwritten manuscripts and layered metaphors. Alchemists, branded by the church as sorcerers, but in truth chemists, philosophers, and astronomers seeking truths beyond the boundaries of sanctioned faith. These societies shared a common thread. They did not deny religion, but neither did they submit to it. They believed there existed a primordial stream of knowledge, deeper, older, and truer, which predated the religious institutions that later sought to redefine reality. And most crucially, they suspected that the Vatican had seized much of that knowledge and buried it behind stone walls. This is why many Masonic symbols can be read as underground maps, a way to pass on truth through imagery during times when spoken words could lead one to the stake. Geometric designs, symbols like the letter G, God, geometry, gnosis, or the compass and square, all encoded ancient wisdom understood only by those who were initiated. The secret societies did not openly confront the Vatican, but in the shadows they served as a counterbalance. They did not seek to overthrow religious authority, only to ensure that the flame of knowledge was not extinguished. And this raises a deeper question. If secret societies managed to preserve fragments of the truth for centuries, it means that the Vatican could not control everything. History, no matter how distorted, always leaves traces. And sometimes it is those who operate quietly on the fringes who hold the final key, the one that can unlock the door leading out of the Dark Ages. In every totalitarian regime, control over weapons or wealth is never the ultimate goal. The truest and most enduring form of power is the ability to shape how people think. And to control thought, you don't need to brainwash. You simply need to leave people with nothing to think about. When history falls into the hands of a select few, and knowledge is dispensed drop by drop from approved pulpits, the public mind gradually empties. They do not question, not because they are forbidden to, but because they no longer know what is worth questioning. It was during the so-called Dark Ages that a vast mechanism of mental control silently took hold, extinguishing the flame of awareness by draining the fuel of knowledge. In the monasteries, monks copied the Bible endlessly, but not the works of Aristotle, Archimedes, or Ptolemy, unless they served doctrine. In the churches, the faithful were taught about sin, heaven, and hell, but never about social structure, true history, or the power of language. Generation after generation grew up with only one vision of the world, that they were sinners, and that only the church held the key to their salvation, and so ignorance became a kind of faith. Those who knew little were seen as devout. Those who asked questions were seen as dangerous. Knowledge ceased to be noble. It became a sign of arrogance, even heresy. It must be emphasized this was not natural ignorance. It was engineered ignorance, cultivated, maintained, and fiercely protected. In many regions, literacy was forbidden to the general population. For centuries, only the clergy were allowed to read. Even monks were denied full access to the Bible, taught only those portions deemed appropriate. The church did not need to oppress every nation. It only needed to keep the world shrouded in a fog of unknowing. And when you live your entire life in the fog, you will think it is light. This is why the journey to control the mind did not happen overnight. It was a process spanning centuries, subtle, non-violent, coercion-free. All it required was time, silence, and for no one to remember that there had ever been another time, another world, where asking questions was allowed. And the most frightening part is this: when ignorance becomes the norm, the one who knows too much is seen as the outcast. The world falls into a cycle, and when the Vatican holds the keys to both memory and the future, it needs say nothing at all. It only needs to remain silent, so that we may all continue to live in a dream, where truth has been replaced by convenience, and light is something you are only allowed to see when someone permits it. It is a bitter irony. While science is born from curiosity, from the desire to understand the universe, life, and ourselves, during the era known as the Dark Ages, that very curiosity became a sin that could not be forgiven. Not because science was wrong, but because it was right. When Galileo Galilei peered through his crude telescope and declared that the Earth revolved around the Sun, he was not merely making a scientific statement. He was shattering an entire worldview, one carefully constructed over centuries. Where mankind was taught it was the center of the universe, created by God and governed by divine will. A worldview the Vatican had sealed with faith, scripture, and authority. For that declaration, Galileo was put on trial, and he was forced to recant the truth before the Inquisition, not because it was false, but because it threatened the system of control. He survived autiste, but spent the rest of his life under house arrest, not because he was a rebel, but because he dared to look to the sky and speak what he saw. But Galileo was not the first. Before him came Roger Bacon, the 13th century English scientist imprisoned by the Franciscans for pioneering ideas in optics and experimentation. There was Michael Servetus, burned alive for challenging certain doctrines and proposing the theory of blood circulation. And there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of other scholars, nameless, unrecorded, erased from collective memory simply because they dared to think differently. The issue was never the content of science. The issue was control of the truth. When the Vatican declared that all truth must pass through the gate of doctrine, any theory that did not fit was forbidden to exist, no matter how correct it might be. Medieval universities, many of them church-run, were not bastions of free thought. They were institutions where students were trained to think correctly, indoctrinated to obey dogma, not to seek truth. Ancient scientific texts were hidden away or permitted only for a select few approved scholars. Knowledge was boxed in. Anything beyond the box was heresy. Even more frightening was the collective fear that emerged. People stopped thinking, not out of ignorance, but out of fear that a single wrong thought could lead them to the flames. And so science became a stranger in the very lands that had once given it birth. It was not until centuries later, with the intellectual revolutions of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that humanity began to shake off the invisible chains that had forced it to bow before the darkness. But by then, how many years had been lost? How many inventions had been stifled? How many truths were killed before they could be born? And the most haunting question of all, how many truths still lie hidden in the vaults, where no light has yet been allowed to shine? Imagine an age where people knew how to build complex irrigation systems, design structures far ahead of their time, and calculate the movement of the stars with astonishing precision, and then all of it suddenly vanished from the timeline. Not because of war, not because of natural disaster, but because it didn't fit the story those in power wanted to tell. For nearly a millennium, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe is said to have fallen into a deep slumber, an era with no major inventions, no grand constructions, no meaningful scientific progress, a period of history that seems to have been placed on pause. Yet curiously, other civilizations did not sleep. During that same time, China invented the printing press, the compass, and gunpowder. The Islamic world performed surgical procedures, advanced optics, and translated the entire treasury of ancient Greek knowledge into Arabic. India made breakthroughs in mathematics, astronomy, and traditional medicine. Only Europe, under the Church's control, seemed to know nothing. In truth, it wasn't that Europe lacked creativity. It was that periods of creativity were deliberately erased from collective memory. Inventors, thinkers, architects, they may have existed, may have left their mark, but their work was never acknowledged, never passed on, or worse, replaced with tales of miracles. If a grand structure was built that exceeded the techniques of the era, no one sought the engineer. They sought a relic. They claimed a saint had touched the stone, and the cathedral rose overnight. Machines were called gifts from God. Unusual knowledge was attributed to divine revelation, and so miracles became the answer for everything that was not allowed to have an answer. That narrative was not harmless. It stripped away belief in human potential. It smothered the desire to question. And it left future generations too afraid to ask, if not a miracle, then what? Who truly created these works? What did they know? And why was it never taught again? In ancient maps, in documents hidden deep within the Vatican secret archive, many scholars believe there is evidence of these broken periods of creativity, strange notations of unknown origin, blueprints beyond the capabilities of the time, notes no one dares to translate. But when miracle is used as the excuse, every question becomes an insult to faith. And so, brick by brick, knowledge was replaced by the fog of dogma. No one remembers the creators, but everyone remembers the miracle. And in that collective forgetting, power was reinforced. You don't need chains if children grow up in a prison they believe is a school. You don't need force if you can control collective memory, starting with textbooks. For centuries, education was not a tool for enlightenment. It was an extension of power, especially in medieval Europe, where the Vatican controlled the entire school system. From lesson content to teaching methods, from the first letter a child learned to the concepts they were never allowed to encounter. A child born into that world would be taught that the earth was the center of the universe, that mankind was created in 6 days, that all knowledge lay within the Bible. And if anything contradicted those sacred words, the fault was not with the text, but with the child. From a very young age, children were taught to believe before they understood, to memorize before they questioned. Critical thinking wasn't merely discouraged, it was considered sinful, because in that system faith was supreme and obedience was the highest virtue. What children weren't taught was even more alarming than what they were. They weren't taught about other civilizations. They weren't taught about Greek science, Islamic medicine, or Chinese inventions. They weren't taught that humans could build their own future. Instead, they were taught all knowledge comes from God, and through one authorized intermediary, the Church. This wasn't an oversight, it was a strategy. When a child is raised on a distorted version of history, they grow up not just lacking information, but lacking the ability to recognize that they are missing it. They would go to church, learn to read, and believe the world had always been this way. That knowledge was the privilege of those in robes, that truth came not from experiment, but from sacred sermons. Thus, an entire generation became faithful followers, not of religion itself, but of submission. The truth never needed to be completely hidden. It only needed to be replaced with more manageable versions. And ideally, injected into young minds before they were strong enough to defend themselves. This is why even today, certain parts of history remain blurred, simplified, or replaced with myth, not for lack of information, but out of an ancient fear that if too many people understand history correctly, they will start asking questions. And when a generation capable of asking questions emerges, power begins to crack. When people think of controlling history, they often picture manuscripts burned, scholars silenced, or secrets hidden in the Vatican secret archive. But there is a subtler way, quieter, yet more effective than any flame ever lit by the Inquisition. The textbook. The 19th century, the age of the Industrial Revolution, rising nationalism, and the standardization of education. European nations began building public school systems, teaching millions of children what was deemed truth. And in this process, history became a political tool. The concept of the Dark Ages was not commonly used during the Middle Ages themselves. In fact, it was reimagined by European scholars, historians, and religious reformers in the 19th century, serving a very clear purpose: to divide human history and glorify the present. By painting the 1,000 years after Rome's fall as a time of darkness, the intellectual elite of the 19th century could proclaim that their own age was the true age of enlightenment. To do that, they needed to turn the past into a collective nightmare, an era of superstition, ignorance, endless wars, and complete stagnation. Convenient, isn't it? If you want to celebrate the light, first create the darkest night imaginable before it. But why did the Vatican remain silent as the Middle Ages, a period they once dominated, was portrayed so negatively? Because they didn't need to respond. For centuries, through their control of knowledge, they had already left behind a fragmented historical legacy, one perfectly suited to being labeled the Dark Ages. And once that label was stamped onto textbooks taught in schools and repeated across generations, it became truth. The 19th century textbook did not merely record history, it established official memory. From Germany to England, from France to Italy, students were taught a neat, linear history. Greece to Rome, to Dark Ages, to Renaissance, to Enlightenment, to modern age. A tidy story, easy to teach, easy to remember, but it ignored so much. The forgotten achievements in mathematics, medicine, and architecture during the Middle Ages, the crucial role of the Islamic world and the East in preserving and advancing knowledge, and most of all, the deliberate obfuscation of the Vatican's role from controlling knowledge to purging dissent in shaping the so-called darkness. Thus, in the classrooms of the 19th century, millions of children grew up believing there had been a time when nothing progressed, when all was steeped in superstition. No one taught them to ask, why, and who told this story? No professor mentioned the secret archive. No textbook questioned the disappearance of centuries of historical records. No one suggested that the Dark Ages might be a coat of black paint, brushed on by those who wished to make themselves appear whiter and brighter. Have you ever noticed that in nearly every movie set in medieval Europe, the sky is always grey? Crumbling castles, muddy roads, peasants in rags, eyes cast downward as if they've forgotten how to dream. Violence everywhere, superstition rampant, and always a dark church looming in the background, its giant cross casting a shadow over all. This is no accident. Cinema, especially since the 20th century, has become humanity's unofficial historian. And in the case of the Dark Ages, it hasn't merely retold part of history, it has redefined an entire era. While 19th century textbooks created the concept of the Dark Ages, mass media turned that concept into an emotional truth. People don't need to read a single document to believe that medieval times were a black hole of ignorance. They've seen it on screen, they've felt it, they believe it. And here lies the danger. What we feel strongly, we rarely question. From Hollywood films like The Name of the Rose, Kingdom of Heaven, Braveheart, to countless series about witches, heretics, and inquisitions, the imagery is recycled endlessly. A stern church, ignorant peasants, dungeons and torture. Rarely do we see the advanced Islamic learning centers, the sophisticated ancient maps, or the influence of Eastern knowledge on Europe at that time. Why? Because the narrative of a dark age where the Vatican was the only light is far too convenient. It's easy to script, it offers clear contrasts, and most importantly, it aligns perfectly with what those in power have long wanted the public to believe. Once the image of the Dark Ages has been seared into collective memory through film, comics, games, and documentaries, any effort to reclaim the truth starts to feel like counter-propaganda. Those who question are branded extremists. Those who doubt are seen as eccentric. Anything that contradicts what we've all seen is instantly resisted. The reality is this: during the so-called Dark Ages, there were quiet advances in agricultural techniques, mathematics, Romanesque and Gothic architecture, and schools of logical thought within monasteries. But such details rarely make it to the screen. And the Vatican? It remains there, sometimes criticized in dark portrayals, yet simultaneously maintained as the sole beacon of knowledge in a supposedly ignorant world. A strange, but useful, contradiction. So when a child grows up learning from standardized textbooks while consuming hundreds of hours of media built around the same narrative, at some point history stops being a question and becomes a completed picture, a picture painted by directors, screenwriters, and the sponsors behind the camera, not by those who actually lived through the era. And thus the truth does not die in the dark, it dies beneath the spotlight. When an institution claims to be the center of truth, the first thing the world is entitled to ask is this: let us see everything you know, but with the Vatican. That has never happened. For centuries, the Church has confiscated, censored, and banned thousands of texts, from ancient manuscripts and scientific records to historical documents and writings from older belief systems. Many of these works were placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, an official list that existed from 1559 until 1966. Even though that list was eventually abolished, reality remains unchanged. The banned works were never re-released to the public. The question is, why? If those texts were truly in error, let modern scholars critique them. If they are harmless, why hide them? And if they simply contain differing, but not dangerous, perspectives, wouldn't an enlightened civilization welcome intellectual diversity? But the Vatican has chosen a different path. At the heart of Vatican City lies a place where even the most seasoned researchers cannot roam freely. The Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archive. Though the word secretum originally meant private, in practice it means sealed. Only a tiny number of scholars are granted access. Each must request specific documents, one at a time, no photography allowed, no copying at will, and any material that contradicts church doctrine is kept in the deepest vaults, where only the chosen few may ever tread. So, what is being hidden? Some scholars believe there are documents that reveal periods of human advancement erased from the official timeline. There is proof of the true influence of pagan, Arab, and Eastern knowledge on early Christian philosophy. And perhaps, there are writings that show many revealed truths were, in fact, editorial decisions. The refusal to release these works is not forgetfulness, or it is strategy. Because once those ancient texts see daylight, the entire historical narrative will have to be rewritten, not just about the Dark Ages, but about the Vatican's true role in creating the very shadows that define that era. We cannot know for certain what is still locked away, but silence, stretched across centuries, is itself a sign that something needs to stay hidden. No one burns books in the digital age. But if the books are sealed away in a vault with no key, how is that any different than if they never existed at all? And in the absence of truth, the official story continues, taught in classrooms, shown in films, retold by tour guides at St. Peter's Basilica, where the light shines so brightly, no one stops to notice the darkness beneath. Modern history often tells us that humanity fell into darkness after the fall of Rome, and then, nearly a millennium later, awakened in the brilliant light of the Renaissance, an age where Leonardo da Vinci redrew the dream of flight, where Copernicus shifted the universe, where Michelangelo carved the essence of humanity in stone and genius. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But if we take a step back and ask, where did the Renaissance truly begin? And why, after 1,000 years of silence, did human creativity suddenly erupt in such dazzling form? The popular answer is they rediscovered ancient Greek and Roman civilization. But something about that doesn't quite add up. First, why did this knowledge vanish for an entire millennium, only to be accidentally rediscovered? Second, how did certain individuals, in a society still socially underdeveloped, reach such astonishing depths of thought, technique, and artistry, almost otherworldly? And third, these ancient sources they found, well, where did they come from? Who safeguarded them for 1,000 years? And why did they surface precisely when they were needed? Once again, the path leads back to the Vatican. Many records suggest that Catholic monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines and later the Jesuits, had long collected, copied, and preserved countless ancient manuscripts throughout the Middle Ages, not to be published, but to be stored. Then, in the 15th and 16th centuries, at a moment when the Church faced a crisis of image and authority, parts of this knowledge were quietly released, branded as rediscovered, and history recorded the moment as the Renaissance. Thus, humanity did not step forward, it turned back into a room from which it had once been exiled. What had been locked away was now selectively reopened, and the narrative of history was artfully repainted. The great painters, astronomers, anatomists became icons of a new enlightenment. But how many of them had access to forbidden, church-held materials? How many had to collaborate closely with the clergy to avoid falling into the trap of heresy? The Renaissance was not an explosion born from the stones of the earth. It was more like a carefully staged performance, where discoveries were released in waves, ideas were kept within acceptable bounds, and light was allowed only where the path had been cleared. And if what the Renaissance delivered had in fact already existed, even flourished, during the so-called Dark Ages, then the entire historical timeline deserves to be re-examined. Perhaps we never truly lost knowledge. It was simply hidden by those in power, only to be returned at a time most convenient for their own shining moment. That light, brilliant but controlled, did not come from a new dawn. It came from a lamp lit within a darkness they themselves had created. Truth doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to be repeated 1,000 times. In fact, it is often the things repeated too often, too perfectly, too by the book, that should raise suspicion. From our earliest years, we are taught that history flows naturally. Rome falls, the world enters a dark age, then humanity awakens through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and into the modern era. Each period is named, dated, and narrated by certified historians. Everything seems logical, clear, unquestionable, and that is precisely the problem, because real history is never that smooth. Real history is messy and full of contradictions, gaps, and fractured truths. Yet what we learn is strangely seamless, and if you dig deep enough, you'll find there are holes that defy explanation, facts that don't align, truths without evidence. This leads to one inevitable question. Has someone rewritten history, not to deceive, but to direct it? And if so, who had the power to do so? Only one group in history has ever controlled all three: knowledge, spirituality, and time. Not kings, not philosophers, not scientists, but the Church. When the Vatican held the entire archive of ancient texts, when monasteries were the only places allowed to copy manuscripts, when ideas that contradicted doctrine were branded heresy, when time itself was recalibrated by the church calendar, when the past was retold from the pulpit, history ceased to be truth. It became a tool to shape belief, to control thought, and above all, to make us forget who we once were. Did you know there are stretches of history that scholars now question ever truly existed? Events that repeat, timelines that jump, figures seemingly cloned under different names. These are not conspiracy theories. They are serious academic hypotheses now back on the table. And if those hypotheses are true, if what we believe to be history is actually a version, edited, staged, spliced, and printed in millions of textbooks, then the question is no longer, are we being lied to? But what do we even remember of the original truth? And when collective memory is rewritten long enough, thoroughly enough, it becomes reality. A reality we are born into, grow up within, and ultimately die believing, never knowing it may not be what actually happened. In every civilization, those who ask questions are essential. They are the catalysts of progress, the needles that pierce the bubble of consensus, reminding us that no truth is immune to scrutiny. But there is a strange paradox. The more precisely they ask the right question, and the more likely they are pushed to the margins. In the field of historical research, there is a long list of scholars, linguists, archaeologists, astronomers, even clergy, who have put forth theories that shake the very foundations of the established timeline. And their outcomes tend to look eerily similar: dismissed, discredited, funding cut, and sometimes disappeared. Some are labeled eccentrics, conspiracy theorists. Some abruptly resign without explanation. Some vanish during archaeological expeditions. Some take their own lives just as they are about to reveal earth-shattering findings. What do they all have in common? They touched something the Vatican is not yet ready for the world to know. Remember, it is rarely the Vatican itself that acts directly. They don't need to. There is an entire system cultivated over centuries: academia, research foundations, publishing houses, media, ready to silence any voice that strays too far. And even stranger, dissenting studies about gaps in the historical timeline, anomalies in ancient calendars, illogical maps, pre-Christian texts, almost never appear in mainstream academic journals, not because they are wrong, but because they do not fit within the carefully constructed historical framework. There are independent researchers who argued that the Dark Ages were merely a layer of darkness painted over a period of remarkable advancement. Some have shown that many historical figures were name-cloned to fill in fabricated stretches of time. Others claim that the Vatican influenced the entire dating system through the adoption of the Julian and later Gregorian calendars, tools that appear scientific but conceal political choices. They do not last long in the field. This is no coincidence. It is an unspoken rule within academia. If you touch the forbidden, you will have no place, even if you are right. And that fear spreads like an invisible disease. Those who remain, who know very well what happens to those who go too far, learn to stay silent, learn to bow their heads, learn to write within standards, until one day censorship is no longer needed, because no one dares to write otherwise. For over a millennium, the Vatican has stood tall at the heart of Europe, an untouchable symbol of power, a place where heads of state still kneel, a religious center whose influence transcends borders, regimes, and centuries. But the closer you approach that grandeur, the more you sense that something is being concealed, not behind darkness, but behind a light that is blindingly bright. On the surface, the Vatican presents itself as a spiritual leader, a beacon of compassion, a guardian of ancient moral values, yet at the same time, this very institution controls the world's largest archive, with millions of documents never released to the public, burned thousands of manuscripts and books deemed heretical, imposed the historical timeline through calendar reforms, crafted the image of the Dark Ages while controlling the only sanctioned source of light. remain silent in the face of archaeological, astronomical, and cultural evidence that contradicts established doctrine, and protects its religious power structure by controlling collective historical memory. This raises the question, is that the role of a spiritual leader or of a gatekeeper of knowledge? Perhaps the Vatican once had its reasons. Perhaps they believed humanity wasn't ready for the full truth. That social order required stability, not chaos born from conflicting narratives. That faith was more valuable than facts. But faith cannot survive without the freedom to choose, and knowledge cannot be preserved by hiding it, because if the Vatican truly holds the light, that light should not be locked away beneath cold stone vaults. If they are true guardians of truth, the truth should be shared, not censored. And if the truths the Vatican holds have the potential to reshape human history, then silence is no longer a virtue. It is a sin. No one denies the spiritual role the Vatican has played, but no one should deny this either. When an institution holds vast knowledge in secrecy, it ceases to merely guide. It becomes the gatekeeper, deciding who may enter the past. And when the past is locked away, the future becomes nothing more than a carefully edited version of what they want you to believe. History is often compared to a river. But what happens if someone redirected that river long ago and we never knew? One of the most controversial theories of modern times, yet increasingly discussed in independent historical circles, is the phantom time hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that a large portion of medieval European history was inserted, specifically that nearly 297 years never actually happened, including much of what we call the Dark Ages. And if this is true, then the current year is not 2025, but perhaps only 1725. Sounds impossible? Let's examine the arguments. First, there is very little solid archaeological evidence, written records, or verified artifacts for many events supposedly occurring between the years 600 and 900. Much of this period's history relies entirely on records written or rewritten by the Church. Second, astronomical events, eclipses, comets, planetary cycles, don't align with medieval timelines. When modern astronomers cross-reference these events using simulation software, they find discrepancies of hundreds of years in some cases. Third, historical figures appear strangely similar, showing up under different names across nearby dynasties, yet with nearly identical descriptions, behaviors, and roles. Is this coincidence, or an attempt to fill in artificially created time? Fourth, and perhaps most important, who benefits from adding nearly 300 phantom years to the timeline? The answer, once again, leads us back to a familiar place, the Vatican. By shaping the timeline, the Church not only gave its power structure the illusion of ancient longevity, it also created a safe distance between the fall of Rome and the modern era. If people believe they have emerged from a millennium of darkness, they are less likely to question the narrative. Some ancient texts even used the Anno Mundi calendar, counting from the creation of the world, and the Byzantine calendar, both of which mark time differently than today's system. The later switch to the Gregorian calendar caused even more chaos in dating events. So who can be absolutely certain that our current year count is correct? If the full truth buried for centuries were revealed, the year 2025 might shrink by several hundred years, not in terms of technology or societal progress, but in the accuracy of our timeline. Now imagine we live in a modern world with AI, space exploration, yet our very timeline may be flawed at its foundation. And if time is the framework that defines history, when time itself is wrong, then the entire human story must be rewritten. No one can say with certainty what the truth is. But as more questions rise, one thing becomes increasingly clear. We do not truly know where we are because perhaps we have never truly known where we came from. We are born into a world of names, dates, and stories already written. We open our eyes in the year 2025, surrounded by books telling us about thousands of years past, of empires that fell, kings who rose, revolutions that shaped the world, and we believe, because no one wants to begin their life by asking, where am I if everything I know about before could be wrong? But then, within the smooth flow of history, there are cracks, there are gaps, there are things that don't add up, and each time we touch one of those fractures, history becomes a thick door opening just a crack, just enough to glimpse that perhaps someone once stood here before us, but their name was erased. We speak of progress, but if the beginning of this journey has been rewritten, hidden, or worse, invented, then we no longer know how far we've really come. We no longer know if we're living on the true day of the story, or if we're simply rereading an old script thinking it's new. And when we forget the true past, we lose more than memory. We may lose the power to shape the future. So if there is anything more dangerous than forgetting, it is forgetting by design. History does not need you to believe. It only needs you to ask again. And if this journey has made you question what once seemed clear, then perhaps you've just taken your first step into a truth long hidden. If you believe this story is worth continuing, hit subscribe, not just to follow, but to keep these unanswered questions alive, because sometimes a single right question is enough to shake the foundations of a carefully locked past.